Okay, so today we're going to look at the cabs on the quad Cortex. And this was due to a comment that was made on a recent video where someone was asking about these. And I've also seen some questions in the Neural DSP forum about people asking, hey, what cabs do you like for this amp or that amp? So I thought it might be useful today just to take a few minutes, go through the cab blocks, understand the basic settings, and talk about which cabs I like best for different kinds of amps and just general approaches to using IRs on the quad Cortex. So I want to start off by saying, I think we all know that impulse responses, and that's what the cab blocks are, is their impulse responses at the end of the day, have a huge impact on the sound of your preset. And there's a lot of options to pick from. On one hand, you've got all the third-party IRs that you can load into the quad Cortex. On the other hand, the cab block itself, there's a lot of cabs to pick from. There's different mics to choose from. You can place the mics in different ways. You can EQ it in different ways. This can be a huge rabbit hole to go down. And my advice personally is don't go down that rabbit hole. Find something that works for you or a few things that work for you and stick with them. And don't get into endless tweaking on how you set up your cabs. Spend most of your tweaking around how you tweak the amp or which amps you use or which pedals you use. Find cabs that you like and then just stick with them. And I'll walk through the 2 or 3 cabs that I like to use personally on the quad Cortex. So having said that, let's get into it. So I'm using this Kraken presets that I used just on the same video I did on the modulations. So it's my Kraken preset that I did the overview of. I'll put the link here. All I've done is I've stripped away a lot of the ambient stuff and just left a little bit of reverb on the end. But it's a nice preset because we've got some clean tones. We've got crunch tones. And even some. And one thing you might notice is I've got 2 cab blocks in this preset and I am switching between them. So I'm having one cab for my clean tones, I'm using another cab for the crunchier tones. So that's something to keep in mind, and I'll walk through which ones I'm using and why I did that. But when we talk about IRs on the quad Cortex, obviously we've talked about the cab block, which is what we're going to get into today, and we've got the IR loader. I did a separate video on the IR loader a few weeks back. I'll link to that here. Other than that, we're not going to talk about the IR loader today. We're going to focus on the cab block. So when you're choosing a cab block, the first choice you need to make is, do you use mono or stereo? And my advice would be stick with the mono unless you need the stereo. So when might you need the stereo block? And I did a video on this new stereo block that just came out. Again, I'll link to that here if you want to watch it. But basically, you need stereo if you're putting a stereo effect up front in front of your amp, like a chorus or a delay or something. And then you're running parallel amps to maintain the stereo. Then you can use a stereo cab to make sure you're maintaining that stereo signal. But other than that, I would stick with the mono cabs. You'll save CPU and whatnot. In terms of the cab choice you make, there's a lot of options here. And you can see the way it's ordered. It starts with what kind of cab is it. So the numbers represent how many speakers and what size speaker. So this is 110 is a 110-inch speaker. 112 is a 112-inch speaker, all the way down to 412 is a 4 speaker that are 12-inch each. So if you didn't understand that, there you go. And then the rest of it is what kind of speaker you're looking at. And there's a lot of information here. So there's a 110 US, that usually means a Fender. PRN is a Princeton, and then the C10R is the kind of speaker that's in it. You know, UK is typically, that means it's a Vox kind of thing. The CA is usually a Mesa match. These are the new matchless cabs that came with the new matchless amps. So that's one of the first things I would say is when you're choosing a cab, one of the first things you can do is try to use the cab that was made to go with the amp model. So in this example, with the new matchless amp models, they released 3 matchless cabs to go with it. So if you're using that amp, use the cab to go with that amp. And I think that's a good way to decide which cab you might want to use. Pick your amp and then pick the cab that goes with that amp. There might be a few options, like 2 or 3, but you've narrowed it down, and then you could just switch back and forth between the 2 different cabs and see which one you like best. So that's the first thing I would do. So other than that, let's get into just what a cab block looks like. So Every cab block on the Quad Cortex has 2 mics on it, and for each mic you can control its position. So that's what you're doing there, is you're controlling where it is in relation to the cone of the speaker. You control its distance. So the distance is how far is the mic from the speaker. And then you've got level, and then you can pan it left and right. So if you wanted to, you could pan the 2 mics, one left, one right, if you wanted to do that. And then you can control what kind of mic you have on. And so the Quad Cortex offers 6 mics. There's 2 dynamic mics, 2 condenser mics, and 2 ribbon mics. I think pretty much every cab that you load up is going to default to using a 57 and a ribbon 160. And I don't often change what mics I'm using. Sometimes I might tweak the second one. I usually always stick with the 57, and then sometimes I'll switch to the ribbon 10. You get a slightly different tone with that. I don't use the condensers very often. If I did use them, I might only use them with a clean amp, but I don't use these very often. I usually stick with the ribbons. Again, I don't usually move the mics. Just so you're aware of how it works, at position 0, your mic is pretty much straight on the middle of the speaker cone. And then as you raise it, you're getting more to the edge. And so if you're not familiar with the differences in where you put the mic, basically is the more towards the center of the speaker you are, you'll get more kind of upper mids and high end. And the more towards the edge, you'll start to darken the tone. In terms of distance, I believe all of them default to a distance of 0. And again, that's where I typically leave them. If you start to bring the mic away, what you're going to do is you're going to start to lose low end. And so if you move the mic all the way and then put the position all the way towards the middle, we're going to turn off this mic so we can really hear the difference. So here's the SM57 centered on the cone and as far away as we can get it. You can hear that's really weak because the distance has taken away a lot of the low end, and the centering it on the cone is making it really kind of trebly. If you go back to where the default is, you get a lot more of a fuller tone. Again, you can tweak the mics if you want to. It's really small variation. I wouldn't usually use a condenser mic. The ribbons are nice. So that's the basics of how the mic placement works. Again, I don't usually mess with this. And one of the things you'll notice is when you load up a cab block, they don't all default to the same position. So for example, this cab block, you can see the 57 is at 4.5 and the ribbon is at 3.5. But if we go to the other cab block, it's at 4 and 4. So Quad Cortex does place the mics where they think it sounds best. So my advice, trust that they know what they're doing and don't mess with that too much unless you really feel like you're the expert at this. I might tweak, the secondary thing. So sometimes I'll switch to the ribbon 10. Sometimes I like how that sounds. But these are very small tweaks. If you start moving the mics around, I think in the end, you're just going to be like, oh, that doesn't work. And you're going to go back to the default. So just leave it where it is. And then there is the new EQ. I use this sometimes for kind of the high cut. Usually I put more high cuts on a crunchy tone than I will clean tone. So this is a clean tone. I don't have a lot of high cut on this. For the crunchy tones, I put a little bit more, again, just to roll off some of those upper frequencies. Because a guitar cab in general typically starts to roll off in that 5 to 6K range, I think. Depends on the cab and the speaker and whatnot. So usually anything above that range, you wouldn't typically get from a real cabinet. So to me, it always makes sense to roll off that on the Quad Cortex. I think it sounds more like a real cabinet. So let's talk about the speakers that I tend to use on the Quad Cortex. So unless I'm using a speaker that's specific to the amp I'm using, and I might do that, say, for the matchless amps or maybe for the twins or something like that, I'll match it with the cabinet that goes with that amp. If I'm not doing that, I'll typically default to one of 3 speakers. For clean tones, a lot of times I'll use this 412 watt. So I like this because it gives you kind of a nice big sounding clean tone. It has some warmth to it and some bottom end, and it's a little bit scooped. So I like this one for clean tones. The other ones I like for clean tones that are 2x12s are, first off, I like the Mesa Recto V30. You can hear that has a lot less low end to it than the high watt one does, but this is a nice sounding cab. The other one that's pretty good is the Zillow Open Gold 19. So if I'm doing clean tones, that's typically where I'm going to land for a cabinet. And again, I typically don't tweak the mic placements or anything very much. I might do a little bit of high cut, but I usually just, set and forget. The other, let's go back to our watt. For crunch tones, my default on all kind of distorted sounds is to use this 4x12 Mesa V30, the 03. There's an 01 and 03. I like the 03 the best. For if I'm doing like lower gain tones, I might use that Mesa Recto V30. So for this one, if I'm doing a blues, so that's the 4x12. If you do the 2x12. So if I'm using something like a Mesa Lone Star or something like that, I might use this one. So this is a really versatile cab. If you want to use one cabinet for clean and bluesy, kind of low gain and higher gain stuff, I like this one a lot. But as the higher gain I get, I'm usually going to head towards a 412, and I'm going to use that CAV3003 here. So those are the ones that I like the best. So even if I'm doing a lead tone, it's the same cab. I don't mess with it very much. I don't change the mics. I don't change the placement. I go with that cab. I set and forget. So anyway, that's my thoughts on using the cabs on the Quad Cortex. I'm sure other people have different approaches to this. Feel free to put in the comments kind of how you like to use them. Again, for me personally, I don't like to get too deep into changing the settings on these things. Find the cabs that you like and just stick with them. And if you're going to tweak the amps, tweak the pedals, tweak the EQ. But I just don't mess with the cabs very much. So anyway, those are the cabs that I like to use best. Feel free to put in the comments kind of the cabs that you like to use best. And if you want to tweak around with what mics are used and where the placements are, I'd love to hear what your settings are. Typically, I don't mess with that stuff. Again, I found the cabs that I like. I stick with those, and I just go from there. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful, and thanks for watching.